Hey everyone, and welcome to today's Explainer. Today we are diving into a really deeply compelling mystery. Have you ever wondered why some nations just absolutely surge forward to become global superpowers, while others, despite starting from the exact same historical starting line, stumble and just face constant systemic crises? Think about this for a second. In the late 1940s, India, Pakistan, and China were all dealing with nearly identical post-colonial, post-conflict conditions. I mean, in a lot of ways, their economies were basically agrarian and really struggling. But fast forward to today, and their paths have completely, drastically diverged. So the big question is, how did China become an undisputed global superpower, while India grapples with massive domestic hurdles and Pakistan faces near-constant systemic crises? To make sense of all this, here's our roadmap for today. We'll look at China's realistic rise, Pakistan's ideological fall, the global power play, the history of the 1947 partition, and finally, India's current domestic challenges. Let's get right into it. Starting with Section 1, China's realistic rise, and how they chose pragmatism over ideology. When you look at the source material, it points to a absolutely fascinating core difference in national strategy. It basically boils down to China's intense focus on pragmatism. While other nations got bogged down in idealistic debates, China leaned entirely into its native Mandarin. They utilized real-time translation tech instead of, forcing a massive population to learn a foreign language from scratch. On the flip side, the analysis highlights how India's heavy reliance on English actually acts as a huge barrier for rural and lower-income youth, wasting a lot of vital potential. Plus, China massively integrated women into their factory workforce. In countries like India, the financial burden is predominantly forced onto males, which drastically limits the nation's total economic output. And this strategy, it extends to absolute independence. They didn't just want to be a massive market of digital consumers for the West. No, they wanted to be a completely self-reliant digital nation. By building out platforms like WeChat and Baidu, they maintain total control over their data and their own narratives. The analysis even points out their ban on private tutoring. It sounds brutal, right? But it was a highly calculated move to enforce a completely uniform education system. They basically built the tools they needed internally, rather than relying on the outside world. Moving on to Section 2, Pakistan's ideological fall and the cost of extremism. 93,000. Just let that number sink in for a second. That is the staggering number of Pakistani soldiers who surrendered to Indian forces in the 1971 war. The analysis uses this specific historical event to illustrate a profound systemic failure. You see, despite having significant international and Western backing at the time, all that ideological fervor just could not compensate for the lack of a realistic military and economic foundation. And the systemic paradox that's really holding the nation back is captured perfectly in this one observation from the sources. Pakistan doesn't have an army. The army has Pakistan. The military establishment completely controls the political landscape. When the military basically functions as the state, well, you end up with constant political instability. We're talking ousted or jailed prime ministers, and a nation that prioritizes military posturing way above the basic needs, education, and economic growth of its own citizens. To really highlight the severity of this dysfunction, our sources note that defense officials have even threatened the use of tactical nuclear weapons. Now, if you're not familiar, these are smaller-yield weapons meant for a close-range battlefield. The analysis points out the tragic, almost unthinkable absurdity here. Threatening to use these means you're literally willing to detonate nukes basically inside your own borders, devastating your own people. It represents a total breakdown of strategic logic. All right, Section 3, the global power play, where we look at pawns and superpowers. Look, none of these countries operate in a vacuum. If we zoom out a bit, the analysis breaks down how superpowers treat global geopolitics like a giant chessboard. It's called the proxy playbook. For example, the U.S. supports Israel to maintain a foothold and monitor the Middle East, and it provides aid to Pakistan to ensure India never becomes entirely unchecked in South Asia. On the other side, China heavily props up North Korea, effectively using them as a disruptive pawn to constantly distract the U.S. and its allies like Japan and South Korea. It's a continuous, incredibly calculated balancing act. So why does this whole cycle just keep continuing? Well, $800 billion. That is roughly the annual United States defense budget. The analysis heavily emphasizes that global military dominance is driven by cold, hard economic reality. War and defense are massive, massive industries. Selling Apache helicopters, fighter jets, and defense systems keeps this entire economy churning. From this perspective, maintaining manageable regional proxy conflicts, it's highly profitable and incredibly politically useful for the superpowers. Which brings us to this really chilling philosophical thought. often attributed to Albert Einstein. The Third World War's date is unknown, but the Fourth World War will be fought with sticks and stones. The sheer destructive power of modern nuclear arsenals acts as a massive deterrent. Because a direct conflict means mutual annihilation, the superpowers are basically forced to pivot towards those highly profitable localized proxy conflicts we were just talking about.
Let's move to Section 4, the history of the partition and the scars of 1947.
To truly understand the friction we see today, the analysis insists we have to rewind the clock. The partition wasn't just some sudden accident. It was a rapid, highly calculated culmination of events. From the introduction of separate electorates based on religion way back in 1909 to the massive violence of Direct Action Day in 1946, culminating in a British official drawing a border that completely fractured communities overnight. The geopolitical scars were purposefully cut very, very deep. Amidst all this extreme violence and extreme polarization of the time, the source material brings up a quote from Einstein about Mahatma Gandhi. "Generations to come will scarce believe that such a one as this ever in flesh and blood walked upon this earth." It perfectly illustrates the sheer historical gravity of that era. The analysis points out that while modern discourse loves to critique historical figures, the reality of managing a fractured, newly independent nation amidst unimaginable violence required a unifying force that is almost impossible for us to comprehend today.
Finally, Section 5, India's domestic challenges and their inward hurdles.
Pivoting from the borders of 1947 to the ground-level reality of right now, the source asks a really vital question. Does external power even matter if your internal foundations are struggling? Take the stark reality of the dual-tiered healthcare system. If you're wealthy, you get same-day access to top-tier treatment, meaning severe diseases like cancer are caught at stage 1. But if you're poor, you are relegated to months-long waiting lists. By the time you actually get a scan, that exact same disease has progressed to a terminal stage 4. It shows how survival in this system is deeply, fundamentally tied to wealth and connections. So what's actually causing this? Well, the analysis points right back to systemic domestic policies. For example, the government places massive import duties on essential medical tech like MRI and CT scanners to encourage local manufacturing. Sounds good on paper, right? However, because there is a lack of indigenous manufacturing capable of producing these complex machines right now, the cost of medical scans just skyrockets. Ultimately, the source argues that these well-intentioned policies inadvertently end up severely hurting the poorest citizens who can no longer afford basic diagnostics. Add in the massive disparities in the education sector, and the domestic hurdles are just immense. And here's where it gets incredibly real for everyday people. The starkest reality of these systemic failures is what it forces ordinary citizens to do. The source outlines a really desperate asylum route. Individuals, unable to find opportunity in their fractured domestic systems, will actually travel to Pakistan to acquire fake documents. Then, they fly to London on temporary visas, completely destroy their passports upon arrival, and claim to be Afghan refugees fleeing persecution, all just to avoid deportation and secure a stay. It's a harrowing, very real illustration of how systemic failure forces people into absolute desperation. Which brings us to our ultimate question. We've seen China's realistic rise, Pakistan's ideological struggles, the massive proxy games played by superpowers, and India's deep domestic hurdles. So I'll leave you with this to think about. As a nation looks to the future, does true success rely more on posturing on the global stage, or does it entirely depend on turning inward and fixing those foundational domestic crises first? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and remember to always keep questioning the world around you. Catch you next time.